Hi, I'm going to introduce my topic, which is, does influence tactics mediate the relationship between transformational leadership and organizational commitment? I'll help you think through this question in the next slide. Does influence tactics account in whole or in part for the effects transformational leadership has on the commitment of the follower to the organization? Here you see the basic model where influence tactics may account for the relationship between transformational leadership and organizational commitment. So we know a lot about organizational commitment. We know a lot about transformational leadership, and we're beginning to learn quite a bit about influence tactics. The things we don't know is how these three variables interact with each other. This is what we're trying to find out. There are some gaps in the peer-reviewed journals surrounding the concept of influence tactics and how it could account for the relationship between leadership style and organizational commitment. The purpose of this study is to explore the stated relationships and increase our understanding about them. If we find some of the influence tactics to be distinct from transformational leadership and still positively related to organizational commitment, we may wish to add them to our leadership toolbox. If we find there is a significant relationship between transformational leadership and the influence tactics, this may help us to understand transformational leadership better. There are subfacets of transformational leadership style, and one may note that the generalized nature of a style means that it is dispositional. Also, I'm going to add, although I don't make this very clear, but I also want to add contingent reward, because in the peer-reviewed journals, we find that contingent reward and transactional leadership in general is sometimes positively related to some good things and sometimes not. And we may exclude management by exception, as some of the literature indicates. So contingent reward has some very positive aspects to it and not so much. By adding that particular subfacet to the research we're going to conduct, we stand to maybe learn a little bit more as to why contingent reward is sometimes positive and sometimes not. That's just a little added bonus that I'm throwing into this research. But essentially, the research is exploratory in nature. Transformational leadership and its subfacets are measured by prompting for specific behaviors. And here we find what those definitions are and examples of what they may be. We have inspirational motivation, idealized influence, individual consideration, intellectual stimulation, and here again is the basic model. I want you to focus on transformational leadership for this model right here. As we move to the next slide, here we understand the subfacets. We can now, or now that we understand the subfacets, we can now look on the model with a slightly higher level of complexity. And as we move along in this presentation, we'll get a chance to look at each one of these variables individually and then all together and see how complex the interactions will become and the beta values that we'll need to be looking at as we try to answer the research questions. The power impact model, taken from Gilbert Fairholm's Organizational Power Politics, Tactics in Organizational Leadership, 2nd edition, page 12, table 2.1 is displayed. to assist me in combating an implicit social cognition, otherwise called bias. You may note in this age-old model that influence is considered a form of power. The definition of power is not limited to the traditional view of an asymmetric coercive force anymore, and as informed people, we might stop looking at it in this narrow common perspective. This capacity is environmental, cultural, and situational, but not necessarily limited to higher power distance or hierarchical relationships. Some think of power and influence tactics as distinct, but Dacher Keltner and Michael Mann's contributions make it clear that this is not the case. This mistake is a result of defining power in terms of the amount of coercive force or consensus involved in an interaction or relationship. However, when my wife makes a suggestion different than the way I was thinking, I'm not afraid of her putting a gun to my head, and in a dyadic relationship, consensus by majority does not exist. Nonetheless, my thinking can massively shift. The same can happen to you. For example, when a cute 35-pound weakling child of yours asks you for a cookie, he or she is causing change and extracting resources from you. How do we account for such powerful interactions? This is the fundamental problem of defining power in a way that does not reflect the real world. Influence tactics are a form of power and an application of that power. I will show why this is important distinction momentarily. There are currently 8 influence tactics that are valid, reliable, distinct from each other, and measured by Uckel's Influence Behavior Questionnaire. Each one of the influence tactics have been classified as coercive, legitimate, etc., or soft and hard. Classifications of power, such as the power bases and power tactics, becomes important to our understanding because they have themselves been linked to organizational commitment. We find coercive power and legitimate power, which essentially is an appeal to authority, are hard tactics. And hard tactics are negatively associated with commitment, whereas referent power is both a soft tactic and positively associated with commitment to the organization. There have been several studies that categorize Uckel's influence tactics as one of these categories: coercive, legitimate, reward, referent, expert, soft, or hard. Here's the basic model again. This gives us a pretty good idea as to what the relationship between the influence tactics and organizational commitment is. But we still do not know how all of these will interact with one another and whether influence tactics can be said to account for the correlation between transformational leadership and organizational commitment. Here we have the influence tactics defined and an example provided for that individual influence tactic. They are rational persuasion, inspirational appeal, consultation, ingratiation, personal appeals, exchange, pressure, and coalitions. Here is a slightly more complex version of that model. And the model will develop as we move on. Now we're going to look at the dependent variable. The dependent variable is organizational commitment, which is broken down into three subfacets, if you will. Effective commitment, normative commitment, and continuous commitment. And the idea is that we take the subfacets of transformational leadership, and including one subfacet of transactional leadership, which is contingent reward, and to analyze what the results of the statistics between each one of those subfacets and each one of these subfacets of commitment. Okay, if we find statistical significance in the relationships, then power may account for some of the relationship between leadership style and organizational commitment. Remember, this is a basic diagram, as we will revisit it later, and it will become more complicated as we go along. And here is the last dependent variable broken down into the three subfacets. And this is what each one of them essentially mean. Effective is want to stay, normative is ought to stay, and continuous is need to stay. The basic thing you need to know at this point is that for each one of these conceptual definitions that I've already provided, the operational definition for each of them is going to be exactly that, as it has been defined and measured by the instruments that I'm going to be using. So in the case of the leadership styles, transformational, and the one subfacet of transactional contingent reward, that is going to be taken from the multi-factor leadership questionnaire, 5X. The influence tactic is going to be defined and measured as it is done by Uckel and Falb, 1990. The dependent variable, organizational commitment, is going to be defined and measured as employed in the Organizational Commitment Questionnaire by Meyer and Allen, 1997. And gender, which is the control variable, is going to be defined and measured as employed in the Globe Study by Gert Hofstede, 1983. Here again is the basic model that's proposed. And here are all of the subfacets. And even though we've got a single line that goes from them to the dependent variable, each one of these can have interaction with the other subfacets, such that, for example, individual consideration may result in a person wanting to stay in the organization. Or it may be the case that individual consideration through ingratiation, for example, or actually we may say more likely personal appeal, moderates that and makes the person want to stay. We'll find out. But every single one of these subfacets will have statistics and beta values for us to understand how it interacts with all of the rest. Here are the research questions. Now, as I just explained, each one of those subfacets are going to have some sort of interaction with the others. And these questions that I'm asking, although it says leadership style, we know that it's specifically transformational as well as contingent reward. And coming back, actually, oh, it doesn't look like I can go back. Each one of these interactions, each one of these questions, research question part 1, part 2, part 3, and there'll be a 4th part. Each one of these questions, you need to bear in mind, will be asked not just of the leadership style in general or the influence tactic in general, although those questions will be asked as well. We will group those together to find out the interaction in total and organizational commitment in general. But we will be asking these questions individually of every subfacet as it relates to every other subfacet so that we can find out the interactions. Research question part 2. When regressing influence tactic onto organizational commitment, is the beta value statistically significant? When regressing organizational commitment onto both the leadership styles, leadership style and influence tactic, is the beta value statistically significant? And finally, when we compare all the beta values, are there any reduction in values? And I'm supposed to explain whether those are partial or full mediation. So basically, it's a 2-step process here. Oversimplifying it maybe, but 1, are the relationships that we find statistically significant? If so, we can move on. And we go through in a logical fashion for each one of them, as a general category, as a facet, and the subfacets. When we do that, the final question we ask are, now knowing that they're statistically significant, or at least the ones that are statistically significant, we're going to look at all the beta values, and we're going to see whether whether influence tactics as a whole and whether each subfacet explains either partly or in full, does it account for leadership style subfacets, the effects that it has on organizational commitment. If it does, then we're in a situation where we can then say that maybe the leadership style is simply a disposition, and it's the specific behaviors that come from the influence tactics that we need to execute. Or we may find that it doesn't at all. But if we find that the influence tactics do have a positive effect on affective commitment, then we want to add those to our toolbox so that we can use those specific behaviors to have effective commitment in our organizations. So again, this research is exploratory, and we're not taking necessarily a specific position, except that we want to know what are the relationships and correlations in these variables. So having said that, if this is in fact live and I'm there in front of you, feel free to ask questions. If I'm not, feel free to send an email to me, and I'll be happy to try and answer those questions. Thank you so much. Take care.